thanks. Well, this is, again, continuing. 2 weeks ago, we had a great discussion about David, about his patience, about ours or our lack thereof. And in fact, we spent pretty much the entire class talking about our first point. Remember, David was chased continuously by Saul, and he traveled somewhere between 400 and 500 miles in those chases from spot to spot to spot to spot. And he never spent more than a day or two in one spot. And he had to flee all over the place. You remember he went to King Achish. And what did he do with King Achish? Do you remember? He pretended he was crazy, and he started drooling from his mouth and scratching on the door and doing all kinds of life. And what did Achish say? Do I not have enough madmen around me that you've got to add one more? But then he was joined by 400 men. And remember what it said about the men? They were in distress. They were in debt. They were discontented. And he turned them from that into, what's the Bible call them? Mighty men. And all of this, God was using in David's life. But it was because I believe that David refused to do harm to God's anointed. And we use that as an example, the fact that just because we win a victory, or we might have escaped attack, it doesn't mean that our enemies are going to quit. And we always have to be prepared for those attacks. We struggle, again, as I said, not against flesh and blood, but against powers, against principalities. And we'll continue to fight similar battles for the rest of our lives. Then we saw Saul in a very vulnerable position. I'm not going to describe that further. But David didn't take advantage of that position, and David again demonstrates patience. And he again demonstrated that he was honoring God. Well, why did God not allow David just to kill him? Get it done with. End your life as a fugitive. I believe it was a test for David, and we talked about that. And it appeared easy, but God never leads us to sin. And sometimes the easiest way out is not the best way out. And then I ask you a question: how often have we taken the easy way out rather than waiting a little bit longer for God? And under attack and under distress, you remember what Paul said. He was in Ephesus, and he was under attack, and they started an absolute riot. The silversmiths were upset because people were getting saved, and they were getting rid of their idols, and it was hurting their business. And so they started a riot. And you remember they felt like David was attacking Artemis, which he wasn't, but they started this chant, "Long live Artemis," and they were in the arena, and they were about ready. I mean, really, Paul had turned the town upside down, literally. And what did Paul say about that? What did he say about that? A great opportunity has opened to me. He's in the midst of a riot, about to get killed, and he says, a great opportunity is open to me. And so I think sometimes God tests us. And David's refusal to kill Saul proved, number one, that Saul's delusion was false. He had convinced himself that David, if given the opportunity, would kill him. But David didn't. And the respect and love David shows here simply erodes Saul's bitterness, at least temporarily. And David captures the spirit of truth found in the New Testament, and it's spoken by Peter. I didn't include this. Did I? 1 Peter 4:8, Jack?
You did.
Okay. Can you read that?
Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins.
So love covers a multitude of sins. Love each other. So that's our challenge to us. So today, we're going to continue in the transition. And I just had to edit this. I had David to Saul, but Saul to David. So from Saul to David. And the transition to Saul was from Saul, or from From whom to Saul? Samuel. And tell me about that transition real quickly. What was that transition about?
The people were wanting a king. God wanted to be their king. They insisted on having a king.
And what was Samuel?
He was a priest and
He was a priest,
and judge.
a prophet, and a judge. So he was a judge, and he was the last of the judges. They transitioned from judge to a monarchy, and the first monarch was Saul. And so today we're going to take a look at three more, if I can get this, three more themes. And excuse me if this is Richard Gere. He actually did a movie on Saul, but he looked kind of like David. So we're gonna take a look at David's encounter with Nabal. We're going to secondly take a look at Abigail's quick and decisive action. And finally, we're going to take a look at the fact that Saul makes amends, but he backslides and David saves his life again. Now, one of the things about action, which is really important, is that it begins, I think, really in your own mind, okay? And what is it? Thoughts. Words produce thoughts. Thoughts produce actions, and actions produce results. So there's words, thoughts, actions, and results. Well, ultimately, the result here was a pretty good one, but there were some pretty important actions and thoughts that went into it. Okay, so let's take a look first at David's encounter with Nabal. 1 Samuel 25:1, Jack.
Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah.
All right, so Samuel dies, and the Israelites gather to lament him. Actually, some translations say lament him. And I was a bit surprised by this. Why? Well, they sure didn't appreciate him when he was alive, did they? As a matter of fact, they complained. They said, "We want a king." Do you think this could be a little bit of buyer's remorse? Do you think? I mean, it wasn't really going well under Saul. And by the way, Samuel had warned them about that, didn't he? Samuel warned them about that. And Saul was surely fulfilling the warning that Samuel really gave to them. It's in 1 Samuel 8, if you want to go back there. But so we learn about Nabal, and that's in 1 Samuel 25:2 and 3.
Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings.
All right, so how many goats? Huh? 1,000, and how many sheep? All right, and I did the math on those kinds of things. It's many millions of dollars, okay? Not just a few million, many millions of dollars. So he was very wealthy. He had property, he had goats, he had sheep, but he was also quite mean, wasn't he? His wife, Abigail, it says, was intelligent and beautiful, right? Intelligent and beautiful. So I'm thinking, okay, he's mean, he's wealthy, but he's mean. She's intelligent and beautiful. What were you thinking, Abigail? Huh? Talk about that.
It was an arranged marriage. She didn't have a choice.
Yeah, more than likely it was an arranged marriage, and more than likely she didn't have a choice. And a lot of times arranged marriages were alliances, weren't they? I mean, why do you think Solomon had so many wives? He had alliances, okay? And so, but do you ever wonder how certain people get paired? I mean, do you ever think about that, really? I mean, what I wonder sometimes, what was God? Never mind, I digress. So did Gigi's. Go ahead. No, but I'll have Nancy speak on it. So David approaches him, and really, what's going on here is that David sends 10 men to greet him, and they greet him in a very, very friendly way. Now, David's not looking for any trouble whatsoever. He just wants food for his men. Make sense? And he may have even given instructions on how to greet Nabal beforehand. So they find Nabal and they tell him, long life, good health to you and your household, good health to all that is yours. And what that means is your family, your servants, and your animals. And then David's man asks him for some food, whatever he can spare, since he took care of his shepherds, and they guarded his shepherds when they were out in the field from attack. And Nabal now responds. 1 Samuel 25, 10 through 11.
Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?"
Now that wasn't too smart. Wasn't very smart at all. I mean, obviously he had to have had heard about David. And he had lots of servants, but he didn't have 400 mighty men. So look at what his comment sparks and see what it provokes. 1 Samuel 25, 12 through 13, Jack.
David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies.
Trouble in River City, right? I mean, really, what's going to happen here? Now tell me, how would you describe Nabal, or his attitude at least? What would you say about his attitude? It's arrogant, okay? It's absolutely arrogant. Tell me what else? Huh? Surly? Arrogant, surly, huh?
Selfish.
Selfish, absolutely. He's selfish. And really, go ahead, Mari.
And his name means fool.
Yeah, so he's foolish as well. His name does mean fool. Go ahead, Bart.
He's unthankful, because David does point out that although he's got an army and the army lives off the land, they have not taken anything unbidden. They're asking for it. So he's ungrateful.
So let me just ask you. Go ahead, Gigi.
Culture is one where hospitality is so important, and you just greet strangers.
And so Nabal wasn't really getting that, was he? Let me just ask you, have you ever been in this circumstance? You're very friendly to somebody, but they don't reciprocate. And they act like Nabal did, rather than when you're friendly, being reciprocal, or at least approachable. Have any been in that position? Huh? What kind of an effect does that have on you? On your emotions?
It's discouraging.
It's discouraging? I have to tell you, I don't feel discouraged by that. Huh? You get angry. Yeah, you get angry, you want to lash out, you want to go for the throat, right? I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that thinks that way. I spent too much time in Chicago. But it makes me mad. And yet, David's men had protected their sheep. So a servant tells Abigail about this. And he also tells her how good David was to them. He explains to her what David did. So being intelligent, Abigail acts quickly to try and rectify the matter. Jack, 1 Samuel 25, 18 and 19.
Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal.
Do you think she knows what's about to happen? I think she's probably got a pretty good idea. So she moves out, she meets David with bundles of supplies, or at least go to meet him. And David's on his way to deal with Nabal and all of his family and all of his servants. Now, these verses give us some insight into what David was thinking. And it wasn't good. 1 Samuel 25, 20 through 22, Jack.
As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing. He paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him."
Who? So what's David's game plan here? Huh? Yeah, scorched earth. He's going in to clean house, big time. Let me ask you, was David correct in his reaction? Why not?
Vengeance is the Lord's.
What, yeah, so what are we talking about here? I'm supposed to allow people to stomp on me and refuse me when I've gone out of my way to help them?
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah.
That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Go ahead. He angry. He was angry. Ken.
You're supposed to give or do the right thing without any expectation of a return. If the expectation comes back, that's wonderful, but it doesn't give you the right to recourse.
Okay, Bert.
I think we're applying New Testament and modern day standards
True.
to this time in history. According to the historical values of his day, he was perfectly within his rights.
Yeah.
You raided towns at will, and if they couldn't defend themselves, everything they had was yours. And he did a lot of that.
Barbara.
But he didn't consult God before he left. Where did do not murder come in?
Is that murder? Barbara said something here, though. How did David normally handle crisis? He prayed, he went to God, but he didn't go to God in this one, did he? He was ticked off and he was acting based on his emotions as opposed to God's wisdom. See, before he had gone to God and asked him for his wisdom in terms of whether or not he should go into battle, should I not go into battle, what should I do here? Here, he flies off the handle and went after Nabal with bad intentions. But how many of you can relate to David? Huh? How many of you can relate to David? Absolutely. It is normal, okay, to react that way, at least for some of us. But God doesn't want us to act in a normal way. He wants us to act in a spiritual way. So let's take a look at Abigail's response, because that's the second point we want to cover today. So what happens here? Abigail quickly tries to appease David. And I think God actually moved her to go. And remember, the Bible tells us that she's intelligent and she's also beautiful. And she demonstrates that in the next verses. She begins to negotiate with David for the lives of Nabal and the servants. And more than likely, Abigail had a good relationship with her servants. Why? They came to her. They said something to her. So that proved that she had a good communication with them. And they wouldn't have come to warn her if they didn't. So she really pours it on her. But I like a couple of things that she said. 1 Samuel 25, 28 through 31.
"Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant.
Now, that's pretty quick thinking, I think. I mean, first, she says, when you take over as king, my Lord will not have bloodshed on your conscience. Okay? You don't want this guilt. You don't have to worry about this. And secondly, when the Lord has given you success, remember your servant, meaning me. Okay, so she probably understood that Nabal, whether or not she knew it, Nabal probably didn't have long to live, particularly with his attitude. But secondly, if that happens, I want you to remember me. Now, let me ask the men a question in here, okay? You've been riding for a while. You're hungry. Your men are starving. You're hangry. Your men are starving. You're tired. And you're mad. You're going after this knucklehead who just turned your men down for food after you saved his men. And this beautiful woman comes to you with everything you need and more. Do you stop and listen to her, or do you keep on riding? How many men keep on riding? That's a no-brainer, right?
She got his attention.
She got his attention, absolutely. And do you think she planned on that? I mean, women, do you think she did a little fixing herself up before she left? Yeah, that's right. She's smart. And it's a good thing she did that too, because look at how David responds to her. 1 Samuel 25, 32 through 35, Jack.
David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me."
All right, hold on a second. David is acknowledging the point I made earlier. What do you say? Praise God who sent you to me. Okay, so God really was the one who moved Abigail to get in front of this and to go before David. And he says then later on, go ahead, continue, Jack.
May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak.
Words produce thoughts, produce actions, produce results. Remember I said that earlier? Bless you from keeping me from bloodshed. Where did he get that idea? Abigail had just said that, right? And she was keeping him from bloodshed. Words produce thoughts. Her words produce thoughts on the part of David. And if you had not come quickly, not one male belonging to Nabal would have survived. Thoughts produce actions. He decided instead not to act. Jack.
I missed verse 35. Do you want it now?
Yeah.
Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request."
Words produce thoughts, produce actions, produce results. And a lot of times, if we're just talking to ourselves, if we're not getting input from other people, if we're not seeking God's input, a lot of times I don't trust myself. I don't know about you all, but I don't trust myself. I consistently ask my wife, is this the right thing I should send? No, I don't think so. I don't think you want to say that. Okay, how many of you have ever been there? And I really do think that sometimes we can feed ourselves with negative thoughts, negative words, and negative thought produce negative thoughts, produce negative actions, produce negative results. I'll get into that a little bit later. But do you think it escaped David, by the way, at this point, that Abigail was so beautiful Huh? No. Yeah, Gigi.
I'm thinking if she had no teeth and was 300 pounds, all the men would be dead, probably.
Did you hear what Gigi said? If she had no teeth and she weighed 300 pounds, all the men would probably be dead. That's good. That's good, Gigi. That's why I married her. Those great insights. So she goes home. Nabal is hosting a banquet. And of course, he's drunk. So she said, I'm not going to share this with him while he's drunk. I'll wait till morning. So Abigail tells him in the morning what she did. And how does he respond? He has a heart attack. And then that just shows you how tight he is. But then 10 days later, God strikes him and he dies. So David doesn't waste any time here. He finds out about Nabal and he proposes marriage. Well, again, Abigail is smart. And she says, of course, yes. And so she travels to David and she marries him. So finally, let's look at Saul making amends, but then backsliding. It was really interesting, though, to talk about the fact that he had a heart attack. Now, sometimes a heart attack is like just waiting to happen in some folks, and Nabal probably lived that lifestyle. But what do you think it was so shocking to him about this news? What do you think? I remember one time we went into one of our clients and I said, that's when Joe Cecil worked with me. I sent Joe Cecil and he started delivering the news. The guy got so mad at him, he had a stroke right there. Why do you think that is? Why? I give Joe a hard time about that, but he had absolutely nothing to do with that. But why do you think that is? Why do you think it was such a shock to Nabal, besides the fact that he was probably a heart attack waiting to happen and probably had gotten drunk quite a few times? Why do you think that was the case?
She stepped out.
Huh?
She stepped out of his authority.
So she stepped out of his control? That's one possibility. What else?
His ego was deflated.
How so, Marvin?
Well, because he thought, she was loyal to him, and all of a sudden she became disloyal.
Okay, what else, Terry?
He might have had a moment of not being a fool and realized what danger he had come under that he didn't realize. And that's something.
Well, that's a possibility too. I think it also had something, go ahead, Mike.
How often have you said something though, and then when it gets translated a few times, and back and you go, oh, shucks. I wish I had said that, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And that could have happened. Or he could have been so attached to his possessions that the thought of giving any of them away just made him crazy, mad, and he had a heart attack. I mean, there are lots of things that it says about Nabal, but none of them are good. So let's take a look finally at Saul making amends, but then backsliding and David saving his life again. 1 Samuel 26:1, Jack.
The Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, is not David hiding on the hill of Hakilah, which faces Jeshimon?
All right, so Saul makes amends, and the Ziphites tempt Saul, and Saul's an easy mark. What do I mean by the Ziphites test Saul? They come to him and tell him where David is. And it's not the first time that the Ziphites have betrayed David. In 1 Samuel 23, they do the same thing. So Saul gathers his troops and they go down to the desert of Ziph after David. 1 Samuel 26:2-4.
So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. Saul made his camp beside the road on the hill of Hakilah facing Jeshimon, but David stayed in the desert. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived.
Well, tell me, why in the heck would the Ziphites go to Saul and tell him? Why? And before we go there, let me show you kind of what you call this the desert of Ziph. And I think it's hill country, but it's wilderness. It's about 4 miles south of Hebron. And what do you know about Hebron? What's Hebron? Why is that important? Well, that's where David, when he was king of Judah, that's where David's headquarters were. And he had 6 children, Hebron. But it's 50 miles south of Jerusalem. Look, you think that looks like a wasteland? And it's also known as the Judean wilderness. And most scholars, many scholars believe that may have been the area in which Jesus was first tempted. Interesting. So it's barren, it's empty. Why in the heck would the Ziphites want that place? And I think despite the desolate nature of their land, I think, and I believe that the Ziphites ratted on David for 2 reasons. Number one, they wanted Saul's favor. Don't you think? I mean, Saul's the king, the Ziphites want his favor. Second, they were afraid that David would take their land, that David would take up residence in their land. Barbara. Well, that's a good point. They felt like, because they did manipulate Saul. They caused him to backslide. And he gathers 3,000 troops together. That's a little bit of an overkill, but he gathered 3,000 troops. And the question is, what was it? And let me ask you, what was it that you think kept Saul going after David? What was it? I mean, here he is back to his old tricks. And he's back to what I would officially call, or officially backslidden, okay? What is it that keeps driving him? What is it that keeps driving him? I mean, David's no fool. He's heard Saul's repentant confession, but he didn't trust him. But what is it that keeps Saul going?
Is it envy and jealousy over David?
Envy, jealousy, yeah.
Well, he wants to kill David because he wants to assure that his son Jonathan will be king.
Even though God told him. Okay.
Well, it says at the time that David was anointed, that the Spirit came upon David, and it says, and God took away the Spirit from Saul. And then we find him nagged by a demon because he throws a javelin at David 3 times and at his own son once. I think he was demon possessed.
Well, he may have been, but he certainly wanted to extend his kingdom. And because of that, I think David knew that. And I think David monitored Saul's movements. And he knew where Saul was, even though Saul didn't know where David was. And I think God informed David. So David creates another plan. And I believe he wanted to show Saul his loyalty again. So David goes, and this is really important, David goes to the place where Saul's encamped. I'm thinking, are you crazy? But 1 Samuel 2, 26, 5-8, Jack.
Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had laid down. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul? I'll go with you, said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice.
All right, now think about this. How many troops are there? 3,000 troops, okay? 3,000 troops, and they're all sleeping at the same time. Okay, and the king's in the middle of those troops, and he is next to Abner. What do you know about Abner? He was the commander of all of Saul. He was a fierce warrior. He was also Saul's cousin. So you've got Abner and Saul next to each other. Then they're surrounded by other troops, okay? And they're working in a concentric circle. What's wrong with this picture? And who's going to get them? David and Abishai? What's wrong with this picture here? Go ahead.
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, you have, anybody who's been in the military, you don't have 3,000 people sleeping at the same time.
Right.
Sentries, right?
Okay, so tell me about that, Ken.
Well, so I was thinking how two people could sidestep 3,000 people. They had to be a God-inspired sleep.
Well, it says that God
Alvin.
caused a deep sleep to fall upon
That's
them.
right.
Fall upon all of them,
Yeah.
okay? All right, so God's hand in this, Barbara. The first ninja. Well, here's the point, okay? And I think it's important to realize this, to understand this, because it relates to us. First and foremost, if God gives you a mission, nothing is too big for you. Why do I say that? Why do I say that? If God gives you a mission, absolutely nothing is too big for you. Why?
That's who he is.
That's who he is, but it's also who we are, and we forget about this. We are his beloved. Can you say that? We are his beloved. Do you believe it? And if we are his beloved, he empowers us. In other words, he gives us power. He equips us. He gives us equipment to use our gifts. And I think that's important. We forget that. Secondly, if he calls us to do something, it doesn't matter what it is. If he calls us to do something, it doesn't matter what it is. He's going to protect us. He's going to provide for us. He's going to oversee us. He's going to lead us. He's going to direct us. He's going to fill us with his spirit so that we're successful. See, a lot of times our ideas are distorted, and that distorts our words are distorted. That distorts our thoughts and our ideas, which distorts our actions, which distorts the results. But if God calls you to do something, we're his beloved. He will not only equip us, he will empower us and make sure that we're successful. Now, let me ask you a question. If your children need something, now I'm not talking about wants, I'm talking about need something. If your children really need something and you know about it, what is your instinct? I'm sorry? You want to give it to them. You want to give it to them. You want to help them any way you can. How many of you have ever been in that position where your kids have really needed something and you've gone out of your way to give them something? Okay. Anything in particular that you remember? Yeah. Yeah. Mari and Ken have 6 children. They all have needed things from time to time. Right? They all have needed things from time.
Sometimes emotional,
Huh?
sometimes emotional, sometimes financial. Sometimes it just needs to be bucked up and give them some confidence to march on.
But Jack, did you have something you want to say?
Not in this particular case.
Kellyanne.
An example this week, our grandkids in Nashville, all 3 have summer jobs, and Andy works downtown 50 minutes away. Anyway, they're putting a lot of miles on their cars. And Heidi made a text because I had asked how the kids were doing after the first week work. And she said in 2.5 days, just one car alone had used $150 worth of gas. And if you have ever lived in Nashville, Nashville's booming, so it's understandable. But anyway,
In a traffic jam, you could use $150 worth of gas.
Right. So anyway, so I walked by Bart's desk, he happened to be there, and I said, I just got this text from Heidi. You think we can help them somehow, and so he said, yeah, write a check. So it just one of those things that comes up on a daily, not a daily basis, but when you're privy to it, you want to respond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say,
Thankful, it's awesome.
I would say that it's true for just about everybody in this class. If it's not true for you, just keep it to yourself. But for the most part, it's true for everybody in the class. Now, let me just ask you a question. And we're talking about if God leaves you, if God gives you, do you think you're a better parent than God is? So do you think if he calls us, that he'll equip us, that he'll help us fulfill the mission he gives us? Alvin.
You said if it's not true, keep it to yourself. They are keeping it to themselves.
I'm
They're
sorry.
not being generous, they're keeping it to themselves.
Oh, okay. That was a bad joke, Alvin. It was even a bad attempt. But Abishai, his nephew's with him, okay? And Abishai sees clear advantage. What does Abishai want to do? What did he say? I won't have to hit him twice. Meaning, all right, let me go. Give me the approval. I'll go get him. And David tells Abishai, he will surely die, but it won't come from me. God will do it in his own timing. And here, God was already assisting them. Saul was completely vulnerable, but David restrained himself. David grabs the spear and the water jug, and he puts some distance between them. And he goes to the top of the mountain. At the top of the mountain, he calls out to the people, and particularly to Abner. Why Abner? His job was to protect him. He was at the center of this. He was responsible for all these troops. And so he challenges Abner. This is great. 1 Samuel 26, 15 and 16.
David said, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?"
How would that make you feel if you're Abner? Huh? Was David correct in what he said? Absolutely correct. And Saul then recognizes David's voice, and he asks David, and David responds to him humbly and respectfully. And then David asks him why. 1 Samuel 26, 18, Jack.
And he added, "Why is my Lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? What wrong am I guilty of?"
What am I doing? How come you keep chasing me? What have I done wrong? Can you relate to that?
But he asked Jonathan that same thing.
Huh?
He asked Jonathan that same thing.
Why is your father after me? Okay, so Saul responds again with a repentant heart in verse 21, Jack.
Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly."
Well, then after that, David shows him the spear, and Saul responds again. Verses 22 through 25, Jack.
"Here's the king's spear," David answered. "Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble." Then Saul said to David, "May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph." So David went on his way and Saul returned home.
You know, this verse here gives us a good indication of why David did not attack Saul, why David did not kill him, why David did not take advantage of his advantage. He mentions in this verse, I don't know if you heard it, the Lord 5 times. The Lord, in a short verse, the Lord 5 times. What does that tell you about David's mindset? He wanted to do what the Lord wanted to do, and he was focused on the Lord. He was focused on seeking direction from the Lord. He was focused on seeking wisdom from the Lord, and he was consistent in that. And they demonstrate also his actions, a spirit of love and grace. He knew, absolutely knew, without the shadow of a doubt, God had promised him he would be king. God had anointed him to be king, and he knew God would have his back and knew God would cover him. The question to you is, do we know that? Do we know God has our back? Do we know that God, it's good rhetoric, but do we actually believe it? Do we test it out and what he calls us to do? Or what he seems to be calling us to do, and then you say, oh, no, God, that's not you. See, instinctively, David knew not to kill Saul. Well, my question is, if he wasn't going to kill Saul, why did he risk his life to go up there in the first place? Do you think David wanted to stop being a fugitive? Yeah, absolutely. He's always on the run. See, David wanted a large measure of God's mercy and grace, did he not? He wanted it, he sought it, he prayed for it, he talked to God. And he received a large measure of God's mercy and grace. God called him what? What did God call David? Man after my own heart. In fact, he proclaims and requests that very thing. Consider these Psalms, 145, 8, 9, and then 51, 1. Listen to what David is saying here.
The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. And Psalm 51:1, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions.
So David is constantly asking for God's mercy and grace. But the command for believers to be merciful is a New Testament concept. So how did David know that? How did David know that? Well, first, before you answer that, let's look at a couple of verses that require mercy on our part. James 2:13 and Matthew 5:7.
Because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy.
All right, those are New Testament concepts. How did David know that? How did David know that instinctively? Yeah.
It says, I have your word in my heart that I may not sin against you. So he had been in studying God's word. He knew God's word.
Alvin.
He also says, thy mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness.
How? Yeah, go ahead. He had the Spirit of the Lord, and therefore the Spirit of the Lord gave him the mind of the Lord, didn't it? The Spirit of the Lord gave him the mind of. Well, guess what? We have the Spirit of the Lord inside of us, and we can access the mind of the Lord if we want to. I think sometimes we are so resourceful that we rarely pray. We rarely pray for God's wisdom. We rarely pray for God's intervention. We rarely pray for God's power. One of the things I like most is going in the back room and having these guys pray for me every Sunday. Because I absolutely believe that as well as I prepare, that's nothing compared to God's power and wisdom descending upon me. And if I don't have that prayer, I miss being able to access that power. I mean, I pray myself, but there's nothing more powerful than brothers in Christ praying for me. How many can relate to that? See, and it's important. We're called as a class, as a church, to pray for each other, to hold each other up in prayer. See, David showed Saul a large measure of mercy because he knew he had received a large measure of mercy and would continue to receive a large measure of mercy. And this reminds me of a couple of other important points here. First, when Saul finds out what David did, and he repents and he apologizes to David, not for long, but he does. But that wasn't on David, it was on Saul, okay? If he feigned repentance or even said he repented, but then went back on it. David's refusal to kill Saul proved that Saul's delusion about David was false. that David was loyal, that David wasn't out to kill him. And as I said earlier, the respect and the love that David shows here erodes Saul's bitterness. 1 Samuel 26, 24, I'm sorry, Jack, 16 through 19.
When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you have treated me today."
See, David captured the spirit of truth, and it's spoken of by Peter in the New Testament in 1 Peter 4:8. Jack, can you read that?
"Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins."
So Saul also proclaims a blessing on David here. And the point I want to make is, what's that in Proverbs 15:1? A soft answer turneth away wrath. I've got to tell you a personal experience about this. We were working with a contractor, and they did a good job in the first half of it, but the electrical was a mess. And I got into an argument with the contractor. And I didn't try and initiate the argument, but basically I suggested that his electrician was incompetent. And he was a young kid and he wasn't certified. He had a certified electrician come in and look at his work and design it. Well, he was really ticked at that and overly protective of his guy. So I was getting nowhere. And I said, look, I want to settle this thing as peaceful as we can. And the more I said that, the more he yelled. So I hung up on him, which made him even madder. I didn't want to talk to him anymore. So Gigi took over. She talked to him. Not only did we get what we needed, but we got about $500 off our bill. A soft answer turns away wrath. And she had that capacity that I didn't have, that I lacked. And it's important that we maintain that kind of spirit in the Lord. Because if we get into the flesh, it's going to get us nowhere. As a matter of fact, I beat my head against the wall for many years trying to do the same thing. And what did Einstein call that? With no change? Insanity. Yeah, insanity. So the idea here is that a soft answer really does turn away wrath. And if you're committed to following God, you're going to consistently have, hopefully, soft answers. Just because they're soft doesn't mean they don't have to be firm, but it's important that we maintain our demeanor. Now, secondly, consider that right here, Saul finally looks to the future. He knows David's going to be king. Real quickly, Jack, 1 Samuel 24:20 through 22.
"I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
See, he really knew that all along. He knew David was going to be king. And it's interesting that Saul asked David not to cut off his descendants. But again, it's about Saul's name not being eliminated. Don't eliminate my name. It's about Saul, isn't it? He's self-focused. He's upset emotionally, but he seems to repent here. But not really. It's still about him. But David maintains that covenant commitment, not because of Saul, but because of his covenant with Jonathan. And we're going to find out more about Mephibosheth as we progress. Next week, we'll finish 1 Samuel, and then we'll move into 2 Samuel.